an elderly vampire, desperate for blood, hung a sign around his neck and begged on the streets. Unable to resist his thirst, he uncontrollably lashed out his sharp claws at passers-by. A second later, a steel clamp violently grabbed his neck. A police officer firmly held the other end, and the clamp emitted a dreadful electric shock. The old vampire convulsed and fell to the ground, an event the surrounding vampires seemed indifferent to. In this future world, a single vampire bat triggered an unparalleled catastrophe. 99% of the global human population was infected by a mysterious virus. From then on, humans could no longer survive in daylight, all transformed into immortal vampires feeding under the cloak of night. 10 years later, the government announced another failed research attempt for a human blood substitute. Human blood consequently became a precious and scarce commodity, with only a few vampires able to afford the luxury of buying blood coffee. Those vampires who hadn't ingested blood for an extended period transformed into terrifying monsters hiding underground. After passing through identity checks, Edward went to work as usual. As the elevator doors opened, the largest human blood bank in the world lay before his eyes. Tens of thousands of unconscious, original humans were chained to machines. As the only remaining humans in the world, their blood had become the company's most expensive product. They were kept there, instruments draining blood from their necks. Their blood kept the vampire world going. All these years, the horrific scene had always disturbed Edward, but he was helpless. As the chief blood expert, his only duty was to swiftly develop a substitute for human blood. In the conference room, a vampire prisoner being used for blood-drawing experiments appeared on the screen, surrounded by vampire leaders from various countries. The experiment showed that this subject, having not ingested any human blood within a month, began to show bodily changes. First, his ears sharpened, then his brain lost its ability to reason, and ultimately, he transformed into a bloodthirsty monster. The vampire leaders present were extremely alarmed. Now, human numbers were below 5%, and the remaining blood could only sustain them until the end of the month. If a substitute for human blood wasn't discovered soon, perhaps the entire vampire population would turn into such monsters. Although the human blood substitutes remained unstable during animal experiments, the leaders insisted on proceeding with human experiments. As Edward injected the substitute into the experimental vampire's body, the man initially remained stable and displayed normal body data, to the anticipation of the leaders. However, as more substitutes were introduced into his system, his body temperature started to climb until the injection was complete. Just as Edward was about to ask the man how he felt, he violently spat out a large amount of pus from his mouth. His body started to convulse erratically, and his body temperature soared even more. This situation greatly exceeded everyone's expectations. Only when Edward quickly injected human serum into the wildly convulsing vampire did he slowly calm down, and the burn marks on his body rapidly returned to normal. Just as everyone thought it was over, the man's head suddenly burst open, and so, the new blood substitute ended in another failure. Leaving the company and glancing at the dwindling human population behind the glass filled Edward with mixed emotions. On his way home, he felt discomfort in his ears. Looking through the mirror, he saw his own ears had sharpened due to his refusal to ingest human blood. While checking, his car inadvertently veered into the opposite lane. An oncoming vehicle with glaring headlights approached, and although he narrowly avoided a head-on collision, the other car lost control and crashed violently into a roadside building. Edward halted his car just before hitting a spiked roadblock. Edward ran out of the car to check the other side of the situation, but unexpectedly the other car downed a woman with a crossbow. The woman did not say anything at all to him as shot an arrow. The woman continued to threaten Edward with her weapon, forcing him to retreat. Several others slowly emerged from the car. It was only after a shared glance that Edward realized that all of these individuals were, in fact, humans. Seeing that the other party was about to continue shooting arrows when the police car's alarm bell suddenly rang in the distance, Edward instantly realized that they were running away from the vampires. Edward quickly signaled them to hide in his car first. Given the urgencies at hand, they had no choice but to follow the suggestion of the vampire in front of them and hide in the car. After Edward activated the daytime mode, the vehicle's windows were all covered. He then painfully pulled the crossbow arrow from his arm. With his disguise complete, Edward calmly closed the car door just as the police car pulled up. They have a screen view of the outside of the car. A vampire policeman asked Edward what was going on. In case of an emergency, Audrey picked up the crossbow and accidentally saw Edward's work ID for a blood expert. The police indicated that they were pursuing a few humans on the run. The police asked Edward if he saw which direction they ran off to. Edward then indicated a direction to the police. The other did not think much about it and then chased after them in the distance. It was only after confirming that the police were gone did the humans exit the car. Audrey expressed her thanks, and then she and the others disappeared into the night. Before long after Edward returned home, an alarm suddenly alerted him that the back door opened. The visitor was his brother, Frankie. Frankie placed a birthday gift on the table. Edward tore off the packaging and the bottle contained a high concentration of human blood. Pouring the fresh blood into a wine glass, Frankie attempted to toast his brother's birthday. Faced with something he had always been resistant to, Edward turned his head away. Frankie saw his brother's health deteriorating day by day. But even then, Edward still stubbornly refused to drink human blood. Frankie was enraged, and a disagreement sparked between the two brothers. Edward conclusively poured all of the blood in the bottle down the drain, seeing the precious blood he had obtained wastefully thrown away. Frankie's rage breached its limit. He violently smashed the blood bottle against the distant wall. As Frankie was about to leave with his luggage, a bloodthirsty monster unexpectedly entered through the exit. They couldn't help but turn pale as they were all too familiar with the terror of this creature. The monster kept twisting its head as if it had smelled blood, and then it turned around and stuck its tongue on the blood-spattered wall and started licking frantically. The taste of human blood after so long seemed to excite the bloodthirsty monster immensely. The metamorphosed claws left horrific scratches on the walls. Seeing that the monster was immersed in it, Frankie slowly moved forward and tried to sneak attack. Alerted by the noise, the beast suddenly roared and turned around, revealing its gruesomely shriveled and coarse body to the brothers. The bloodthirsty creature twisted its head as if attracted to something. Then it found a glass of human blood on the table and began to suck on it. Edward attempted to take advantage of the situation by reaching for a dinner knife, but the panicked state caused him to fail. Frankie was trying to fight the monster with the knife, but in the next second, the bloodthirsty monster swung its claws, and Frankie was hit by a terrible blow and fell unconscious on the spot. To survive, Edward urgently raised his nearby chair, shouting for his unconscious brother while continuously retreating. Hearing Edward's shouts, Frankie woke up from unconsciousness. Seeing his brother in danger, he hurriedly picked up the sharp blade in front of him and pulled the dining table apart to create space to move. The two brothers began to encircle the beast, trapping it between them. When the opportunity arose, Edward and Frankie initiated the attack. Unexpectedly, the creature flipped around and hung from the ceiling using its claws. Frankie rushed forward again with a sharp blade in his hand, and when he saw the right moment, he slashed a horrible wound on the monster's chest, and a large amount of foul-smelling black pus flowed down from the monster's chest at the same time. Frankie quickly swung his blade down at the creature's neck, and the bloodthirsty creature's body lost its grip and fell to the ground. After a tough battle, the brothers finally killed the bloodthirsty beast. Vampire policemen then arrived at the scene to clean up the mess. The sheriff stated that this was already the third home invasion in the area since the beginning of the month, presumably in search of food. Those bloodthirsty creatures have all fled to the outskirts, cutting off the creature's finger and using the ring left behind. The police learned that the bloodthirsty creature was once known as Carl. This information shocked Edward because that was his gardener he had known for many years. Upon searching the creature's body, there were remnants of other vampires' corpses. And not only that, but there were gnawing wounds on its arms. Apparently, it had been sucking its own blood, an act that would no doubt accelerate its mutation process. As dawn approached the next day, with the alarm system sounding another reminder, Edward cautiously walked towards the back door. As he turned on the lights, to his surprise, he saw Audrey, whom he had previously saved, standing before him with a crossbow. Edward asked Audrey if she had come to kill him. She explained that she knew that Edward was researching human blood substitutes, but it was merely a method and couldn't cure the vampiric instinct for blood. She said she found a solution that could permanently resolve everything. After speaking, Audrey passed him a note with a time and location before leaving the place. As the reserves of human blood continue to dwindle, investors are withdrawing the humans from the company. Edward's company had lost its capacity to supply blood nationwide. At this point, Charles found Edward to expedite the research on a substitute for human blood. Edward tried to ask Charles if the imprisoned humans could be set free once the substitute was developed. Charles dismisses this request out of hand, because even if a human blood substitute could be developed to satisfy the needs of the vampire population, the high-ranking leaders would still choose the more flavorful human blood. Charles's answer undeniably shattered Edward's hopes. Edward turned on his daylight drive and came to the agreed-upon location. Stepping out of the car at the risk of being burned by the sun, Edward met a man with a weapon behind a tree. What he didn't know was that Audrey, on lookout at the time, had been captured by the armed personnel following them. Elvis pulled Edward's hand to his own chest and outright declared that he too was a vampire. Edward was taken aback because even though Elvis indeed had no heartbeat, he could stand in direct sunlight without any harm. Edward had just decided to ask Elvis how he managed to do this when Audrey was brought before them, held hostage. Seeing this, Elvis swiftly pointed his gun at their enemy. Only when the soldier opened his heavily guarded helmet did Edward realize the enemy was actually his brother, Frankie. Seeing both sides on the verge of a fight, Edward quickly stepped in the middle to mediate. As an armored vampire vehicle ferociously approached from afar, Audrey seized the opportunity to break free and fiercely pushed Frankie into the sunlight. Immediately, Elvis rushed forward and punched Frankie unconscious. As Audrey and Elvis were planning to leave the scene, they noticed the armored vehicle initiating an attack, which left their car riddled with bullet holes. Elvis is furious when his car is destroyed, but the silver cones he fires have no effect on the armored car. Noticing the enemies were now shooting tranquilizers, Edward quickly called for them to get in his car. Unfortunately, it was clear that the enemies had come prepared. As soon as Edward drove onto the road, he was met with a blockade. The armored vehicle relentlessly shot at Edward's car, suffering heavy damage and sunlight pouring in through the bullet holes. They lost sight as the surveillance equipment was destroyed. Seeing this, Elvis hurriedly changed to the driver's seat and quickly turned the car around and drove into the forest based on his view through the bullet holes in the windshield. But the other car was too strong for him, and he couldn't get away from the other car until he reached a fork in the road, where a third armored car was coming after him. Elvis, familiar with the terrain, knew that the broken bridge ahead was his last chance, and he had no choice but to fight to the death. As his feet accelerated again, he drove the car straight through the fence, relying on the inertia of the chassis on the track. Friction sparks so dangerous to reach the other side of the bank. The rear of the large armored car was not so lucky. One car could not brake in time to rush on the spot was broken rail through, and then there was a violent explosion, burst into flames, fell to the bottom of the valley. In this way, they narrowly escaped their pursuers and drove off into the distance. After several hours of driving, they reached an abandoned bridge tunnel in the middle of the night. Elvis then explained that his transformation was purely accidental as he possessed no understanding of the science underlying the events. He proceeded to tell Edward his secret of how he transitioned from a vampire back to a human. The vampire angrily returns the human blood coffee to the shop, where the clerk explains that the blood levels have been lowered due to government restrictions on blood supply. The male vampire, who has not been able to get enough blood for a long time, becomes agitated. Seeing the employee unable to meet his request, the vampire set his eyes on the human blood bags in the shop and attempted to steal one while the employee was not looking. During the struggle, a blood bag burst open, spraying human blood everywhere. The moment they tasted the blood they had not seen for so long, the vampires could no longer control their thirst for blood. The vampires lost their minds and hissed and screamed as they rushed to the human blood shop and started to snatch the blood bags like hungry beasts. The vampire police force rushes over upon hearing the commotion, but even their terrifying electric shocks fail to stop this group of vampires who have completely lost their senses. The shop assistant tries desperately to close the window while the vampires outside are eating in a frenzy. The scene is chaotic, filled with the overpowering desire for blood. At this moment, reputation, status and duty are no longer important. All vampires are fighting for blood. The social order of the vampire world collapses entirely at this moment. On the other side, after an examination, Edward finds that Elvis's blood sample under ultraviolet rays is no different from other vampires, so he also doesn't understand why Elvis has turned back into a human. Elvis explains that the process was very strange. He lost his alertness due to not having consumed human blood for a lengthy period, leading him to crash his car into the fence by a lake due to his haze. He was thrown out of the car by the momentum of the crash. His body caught fire under the sunshine. He screamed and howled as he was flung into the lake. However, something incredible happened when he emerged from the water. Feeling weary of life, he stepped out of the bridge tunnel, and to his surprise, his body remained unscathed under the sunlight. It was this encounter that unexpectedly caused him to transform back into a human. They found Edward because they wanted him to recreate this process. Edward believes that the key to changing the blood may be the amount of sunlight exposure. He then sees a wine fermentation tank. Upon inspecting it, he finds it can be utilized because of its enclosed nature. They immediately start the modification process. At that moment, Out in the field, the rescue team is unfortunately hit with a flat tire while returning to base. The convoy has no choice but to stop temporarily. Jarvis, the team leader, gets out of the vehicle to inspect and discovers a tranquilizer dart. Everyone quickly arms themselves, getting ready for a potential attack. Then, from the dark, an onslaught of tranquilizer darts comes shooting out. Jarvis immediately engages in retaliatory fire. In tandem with a great explosion, an approaching vampire squad, hidden in the darkness, reveals itself. Caught in an ambush, the rescue team is taken by surprise and quickly suffers extensive damage. Attacked by anesthetic needles fired from all sides, the rescue team suffered heavy casualties and were no longer able to fight back. Allison had just picked up the radio to inform the human base of the attack when she was captured by the encircling vampires. By tracking the radio signal, Frankie has found the location of the human refuge camp. As a result, all humans decide to evacuate. Elvis calls for Edward to withdraw with him, but Edward insists that with sunrise imminent, they may never get another chance for this experiment, so he must continue. With time running out, Audrey adjusts the mirror to reflect the sunlight and Elvis drapes a wet bedsheet over Edward. They stand inside the closed fermentation tank, ready. As Elvis opens the cover, a tremendous amount of heat immediately engulfs Edward's body. Hearing Edward's hysterical screams, Elvis hurries to close the cover while Audrey activates the extraction to draw all the fire from the container. Observing Edward's body temperature not rising through the equipment, Audrey asks about Edward's condition. At Edward's signal, they decided to keep trying. Meanwhile, the armored troops are getting closer and closer. Flames aggressively burn every inch of Edward's skin. The pain of enduring such an intense heat over a prolonged period is beyond any description. However, once the flames are vented out of the container, his body temperature drops back to a normal level. They had no choice but to repeat the process again. This time, Edward deliberately exposes his chest to the sunlight. Terrifying flames continuously scorch his body. By the time the timing was right, Audrey successfully extracts all the flames. By this point, the armored convoy has already reached the camp. As Edward's heart rate monitor starts to fluctuate, he takes a deep breath and collapses on the ground. Audrey steps forward, worried. At this point, Edward's pupil color fades and he is literally human again. The vampire troops storm into the building, starting to search. They open the fermentation tank but find it empty. By now, the three of them had already hidden in another tank. Having found nothing, the vampire troops retire and depart. Meanwhile, Allison has been captured and taken to Charles's office. As the lift door opened, they looked at each other. Charles had a complicated look on his face. It turned out that Allison was his daughter who had run away for a long time. After a long absence, Charles dismisses Allison's pleas to free her companions and tries to hold her. However, she angrily escapes towards the elevator. It is then that Charles realizes he's been stabbed. As the lift opens, Frankie appears with a gun and knocks Allison unconscious. Knowing fully well his daughter's distaste for vampires, Charles pleads with Frankie to help him with something. As Frankie enters the room where Allison is held captive, he advances, explaining that she wouldn't have to live in fear if she became a vampire. Sensing his intentions, Allison fights back with all her might, pushing Frankie towards the door. However, she proved no match for his supernatural strength, and Frankie's fangs sink deep into Allison's neck. After the incident, when Charles visits her cell, he freezes at the sight. Allison is leaning against a corner, her body drenched in blood. When she turns around, it's revealed she's drinking her own blood. Charles thought that his daughter would accept him if he forced her to become a vampire, but he didn't realize that she would rather turn herself into a bloodthirsty monster in order to resist. The sight of Allison, acting like a mad, blood-crazed creature terrifies Charles. When the guards finally take Allison away, he realizes what he's done. Due to the continuous decline in human stocks, the price of human blood soars. Many vampires can no longer afford it, leading to a significant increase in the number of bloodlusting creatures. From this point, the vampire government declares a state of emergency. The once crowded streets are now desolate. Vampire troops gather to officially start hunting the bloodlusting creatures hiding underground. Under the immobilizing hold of iron chains, thousands of vampires turned into bloodlusting monsters are sentenced to death. Despite their desperate struggles, they are forcefully dragged into the sunlight by armored vehicles. A female monster at the end, holding onto Frankie, is nonverbal but somehow recognizable. It's Allison, who he had turned. The armored car starts to move slowly, The vampire watching from the sidelines had a complicated expression. Perhaps they're worried about the day they'll become prisoners. As the armored car moves under the sunlight, the bloodlusting monsters are forced out, catching a flame almost immediately. Their heart-wrenching screams and cries can't change their fate. One by one, they disintegrate into dust under the scorching sun. Frankie looks upon this gruesome scene, with Allison striving with all her might to look back at him. At this moment, Frankie might be filled with regret for his actions, until Allison, wrapped in flames and shrieking hysterically, forces him to close his eyes, no longer daring to watch. Then, Allison is consumed by the fire, completely obliterated into nothingness. After the roaring flames under the daylight, the monster's howls and screams are absent, leaving only the cold shackles. When all the bloodthirsty monsters are killed, Frankie turns his head and the vampire soldiers behind him seem extremely excited. It's as if once they've dealt with these monsters, society will return to normal once again. In the evening, Christopher came home to see Edward and the others waiting. Faced with Edward, who had transformed back into a human, Christopher, a blood expert himself, struggles to believe his own eyes. Edward conveys that he has found a way to become human again. As long as they can recreate this process, all vampires can be cured. As Christopher is just about to ask Edward how he managed to do this, the phone suddenly rings. Christopher stepped behind the glass between calls. As longtime colleagues, Edward didn't have his guard up against Christopher. However, after 10 minutes, the sound from behind the screen ceases. However, after 10 minutes passed without any sound, Audrey became aware of the unusual situation and cautiously approached to investigate. Unexpectedly, an anesthetic needle was shot at her from the darkness. Upon hearing the commotion, Edward and Elvis quickly rush over, but it's too late. They witness soldiers taking the unconscious Audrey away. Then, both sides start an intense gun battle within the confines of the narrow house. In the chaos, Elvis, along with Edward, escape towards the underground passage. However, as they escape, a soldier notices their direction. Elvis then leads Edward to his former car dealership, where he switches on the lights to reveal a bloodthirsty monster in hiding. Seeing the monster charge roaring at them, an arrow timely pierces through the monster's chest. It's the doing of Frankie, who had been trailing them. The atmosphere is getting tense. None of them are willing to put down their weapons. Seeing his brother turned back into a human, Frankie can hardly believe his eyes. Edward calms Frankie down and explains that he has found a permanent cure for vampirism. Frankie, who hasn't been able to consume human blood for a long time, has sharpened ears and a bloodless face. Already quite disappointed with the vampire society, Frankie still puts down his weapon under Edward's persuasion. However, just as Edward and Elvis let their guard down, Elvis steps forward to grab a weapon. Frankie, with a murderous look in his eyes, stares intently at Elvis's neck. In the next second, he fiercely bites down. Edward struggles to pull Frankie away as Elvis bleeds profusely. Collapsing in pain, Edward disappointedly aimed his crossbow at his brother. Just as he was about to fire, his face suddenly filled with shock, causing him to slowly lower the crossbow in his hand. Shortly thereafter, Edward takes the risk of going to the company alone, where guards escort him to Charles's office. As Charles has indulged in a large amount of Audrey's blood, she was incredibly weak at this moment. Edward, with a look of fear on his face, expressed that he had come to a realization and no longer wanted to endure the fear of being human. He pleaded with Charles, offering to trade the method of creating a substitute for human blood in exchange for being turned back into a vampire. Audrey did not expect Edward to defect at the last minute. Charles then told his subordinates to leave and informed Edward that there had been a problem with the blood supply during his absence. Vampire civilians, the army, the government, they all seem to be starving. However, these issues are a thing of the past. Christopher has developed a human blood substitute and the government has already been mass-producing it. Thus, he doesn't need a vampire cure. Upon receiving this news, Edward looks pained. He then asks Charles what it feels like to kill his own daughter. Charles was furious when the scar was revealed and he bit Edward on the neck. A large amount of blood came out and quickly soaked Edward's shirt. However, after sucking human blood, Charles does not feel pleasure, but rather looks extremely painful and weak. As Edward slowly turns around, Charles realizes it's Edward's blood that's the problem. He quickly presses the emergency button. It turns out that after Frankie bit Elvis, Elvis did not reinfect and turn back into a vampire. Conversely, Frankie, who sucked his blood, turned back into a human. At this time, due to Edward's blood causing a strong reaction, Charles falls to the ground, convulsing until his eyes turn back to that of a human. Edward explains that the cure for vampires is actually their blood. At the same time, a large army of vampires arrived at the company. Hearing the sound of the elevator, they prepare themselves, pointing their guns at the elevator. However, when the elevator opens, what appears in front of the group of vampires are the bound Charles. Faced with the now human Charles, this group of ravenous vampire soldiers can no longer control their bloodthirsty nature. They put away their guns, one by one, rushing into the elevator like beasts, tearing Charles apart and eating him. Edward, thinking that taking the stairs would avoid search, was met with vampire soldiers in the lobby. As the vehicle rushed into the place, Frankie got off the car and started a fierce gunfight with the soldiers. Just as they had dealt with the enemies in front of them, a large number of vampire troops rushed to the scene again, surrounding them in an instant. Facing the situation, Frankie helplessly looks back at his elder brother. Then, faced with the hungry former colleagues in front of him, Frankie tries to persuade them that he already knows the antidote to end it all, so there's no need to create unnecessary casualties. But the thirst for blood had already taken over the minds of all the vampire soldiers present. Frankie looked helplessly at Edward, then chose to sacrifice himself by laying down the gun in his hand. At this point, the thirsty vampires could no longer control themselves. One by one, they bared their fangs and lunged at Frankie. Just then, guards rushed out and took the opportunity to capture Audrey. Edward tried to stop them, but he couldn't save everyone. Feeling the tearing in his body, Frankie let out a hysterical scream. Edward desperately kicked the door open and thrust a wooden stick into the guard's heart. Facing the onslaught, Edward's mind was filled with thoughts of vengeance and slaughter. Audrey also struggled to fight back, picking up a sharp blade on the table and thrusting it into the guard's neck. With a single wooden stake piercing the body, the enemy was completely dealt with. At this point, Edward looked helplessly at the monitor screen. His brother had lost his voice and was surrounded by layers of vampire soldiers. But after feeding, the first few soldiers also reverted to humans. They instantly understood their situation when they heard the low growl coming from the throats of the vampire soldiers behind them. Yet it was all too late. Unable to stop themselves, the vampire soldiers moved forward one by one, hungrily charging at the new prey. Confronting the ghastly scene unfolding in the hall again, Edward could do nothing but allow the brutal vampires to continue suckling and turning back into humans. For a time, the hall was filled with blood flow, screams, everywhere filled with vampires' bloodthirsty primitive instincts. Like the end of the world, like a horrible scene, vampire social order completely collapsed at this moment. When everything is over, Edward and Audrey out of the monitoring room. As far as the eye can see, all over the corpses miserable. Only a few humans survived. The reconstruction of human civilization was far worse than Edward had expected. He has just found Frankie in a pool of blood and has not yet recovered when gunshots ring out and Christopher appears with a gun and kills all the survivors in a flash. Christopher stated that vampires cannot be cured, as he had painstakingly developed human blood substitutes. Just as Christopher was about to kill Edward and Audrey, a crossbow bolt shot through. Then, he burst into flames. It was Elvis who had arrived just in time. By now the sun was rising and Edward knew that this was just the beginning. Facing a world of vampires, they still had a lot to do.